The Myrtles Plantation in southern Louisiana often tops those most haunted houses in the USA lists. And looking at all the claims over the years, it's not hard to see why. With stories of brutal punishments inflicted on slaves, and Civil War deserters who were dragged back to face judgment, not to mention the scores of family members who were born, lived, and then died in this sprawling house. But is the Myrtles Plantation really as haunted as it's claimed to be? So the site that the Myrtles Plantation sits on now in St. Francisville, which is about 30-ish miles north of Baton Rouge, it was first built by a guy called General David Bradford. And it kind of wasn't by choice, because David Bradford actually came from Pennsylvania and was infamous for his part in the Whiskey Rebellion, which was basically unrest caused by, amongst other things, a ridiculously high tax on the farmers who were distilling and selling whiskey. And in 1794, he led a militia to Pittsburgh, but the president at the time, George Washington, sent 13,000 troops to kind of quash the rebellion. There was a warrant out for David Bradford's arrest, so he made his escape out of the colonies and down into the Spanish-controlled Bayou Sara, which is now known today as St. Francisville. In 1796, David bought the 600-acre site and built a house for him to live in called Laurel Grove, while he basically hid out. In 1799, President John Adams officially pardoned him, and so his wife Elizabeth and their 5 children moved out to this house, Laurel Grove, to join him. And so they started this new life. David obviously was running the plantation, but then he would also teach law students from the house, because this guy was actually a lawyer before he got involved in the whole Whiskey Rebellion thing. In 1808, David Bradford passed away, leaving his wife Elizabeth to manage the plantation. She roped in one of her husband's old law students, who was now a judge, called Clark Woodruff, to help her out. And he actually ended up marrying one of the Bradford's daughters, Sarah. And together they had 3 kids, Cornelia Gale, James, and Mary Octavia. But it's Clark Woodruff who is in the centre of probably what is the most famous story that surrounds the Myrtle Plantation nowadays. And there are so many different versions of this story. There's a lot of rumours and legend has it and some say. And so if you've heard a different version of this story, please leave it down in the comments. There will be that many different versions, it's ridiculous. Because the story that is most often repeated goes that Clark had taken a shine to one of the slave girls called Chloe, and he'd brought her into the main house to help with the household, doing cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. But apparently Clark had also basically forced Chloe into being his mistress. Time passed, and that's how things were for a while, and it's not quite clear if Clark lost interest in Chloe, whether he'd turned his attention to another slave and Chloe didn't want to lose her position working in the house, or whether she was just trying to get any dirt on Clark that she could so that she could blackmail him. But for whatever reason, one day Chloe was found eavesdropping outside a door where Clark was discussing family business. Like, Clark opened the door and there Chloe was with her ear pressed to the door. Obviously she didn't have a good enough explanation as to why she was there, so apparently Clark dragged her out to one of the outbuildings and cut off one of Chloe's ears as punishment. She was also demoted to working in the exterior kitchen, which wasn't quite as backbreaking as working in the fields, but still a brutal manual job compared to working in the main house. Chloe also started to wear a green turban to hide what Clark had done to her, and quietly decided that something needed to be done. She wasn't going to carry on working in the exterior kitchen for that man. Something had to change. She was going to bake a birthday cake for the eldest Woodruff daughter, Cornelia, and it was going to contain a secret ingredient, oleander, which is poisonous. And so this plan that she'd settled on, again, it's unclear as to her motives. Some say it was to get revenge on Clark by killing his family. Others say she didn't want to kill them, just make them sick so she could be the one to nurse them back to health and get back into the family's good graces. And by extension of that, hopefully get her old duties back. We don't really know. But either way, Chloe put enough oleander into this cake so that when the 2 children, Cornelia and James, as well as their pregnant mother Sarah, had a piece, it was enough to kill them all. After the family had died, apparently Chloe was caught by the other slaves trying to escape the plantation. Or another version is that she'd gone to the slaves to try and get help from them, to try and cover her basically, but maybe out of fear of all of them being punished, like Clark had just lost his entire family now, the slaves hung Chloe in one of the trees behind the house. And then, apparently, they threw her body into the Mississippi River and had it weighed down so that it wouldn't float back up. Because it said if the body is weighed down, then the person's spirit won't be able to return to the plantation and do any more harm after death. And so that is the story. There is a little bit more to it, but I'm going to keep you in suspense a little bit longer, as there is plenty plenty more history about this place to tell you about, because Woodruff eventually sold the plantation to Ruffin Gray Sterling in 1834. And this guy owned other plantations in the area, he was a very wealthy man, and he actually set about renovating the entire house. By the end of it, he'd actually almost doubled the size of the house, brought in the finest furniture, a huge £300 chandelier, like all sorts. He'd also renamed the property from Laurel Grove to the Myrtles, because of the crepe myrtle trees that grew on the property. And so Ruffin and his wife lived happily in the newly renovated house, having 9 kids, 7 sons and 2 daughters. But the Sterling family would suffer a lot of loss, as 5 children died over the years of tuberculosis. Like, we're still talking the early 1800s. Penicillin is still decades off from being discovered. In 1854, Ruffin passed away, leaving his wife Mary in charge of running the plantation. And one of their daughters, Sarah, she married William Winter, a lawyer. He moved on to the Myrtles, took over running the plantation, and together Sarah and William had 6 children. But it was during this time that the American Civil War was kicking off. And this was a bit unclear in the Myrtles history. I read somewhere that the tour guides at the Myrtles say that William Winter was a Union supporter, and the house was used as a hospital for both Confederate and Union soldiers. But the general consensus, online and in the books that I used, is that William Winter and his family were on the Confederate side. And there wasn't any mention of a hospital, although it does appear that injured Confederate soldiers may have been laid up here for a while. But what's also reported is that yes, the Myrtles house did survive the war, but it was actually at some point raided by Union soldiers and looted for all the expensive belongings that Ruffin Sterling had brought when he first renovated the house. There was also a story about 3 Union soldiers who were shot and killed within the house while they were ransacking it. But other than the story itself, there's no actual evidence of this. What we do have evidence of, in the form of newspaper articles from the time, is William Winter's murder within the house. Because on the 26th of January 1871, Winter was in the gentleman's parlour giving a lesson to his son Francis. At that moment, a man came riding up to the house on a horse, shouting over and over, "Gentleman in need of an attorney." Obviously, William Winter was an attorney, so he went outside through the side door to see what he could do for this horseman. William says to the man, "I am an attorney, how can I help?" To which the guy goes quietly, "Are you William Winter?" William obviously responds, "Yes." And the horseman pulls a shotgun out of its holster and shoots William in the chest. The rider gallops away on his horse and is never even identified, let alone captured, for William's murder. After his death, Sarah, his wife, carried on living in the house, but when she died, it then starts passing through family members and being purchased and all sorts. But it seems like a pretty important detail to include here. The plantation never really fully financially recovered after the Civil War, which, I mean, kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Considering not only were all of their expensive belongings looted, but also the fact that slavery was abolished after the war and all of that. In December 1953, Marjorie Munson, a widow, bought the house. And it's interesting that it's apparently at this time that the ghost stories just explode. In the 70s, it was purchased by James Myers and Frances Kermeen, who turned it into a B&B. And Frances, she was the one who wrote the book The Myrtles Plantation, the true story of America's most haunted house. So you can imagine her experiences with living there. In 1992, Tita and John Moss take on the Myrtles, and now I think their son Morgan is also involved in owning/running it too. But nowadays, it's a super popular visitor attraction. It's still a B&B, so you can still stay the night there. And they've got a restaurant, and obviously they do guided tours around the place to talk about both the history of the Myrtles and also the mystery. Ooh. Because they're another place, they lean into the paranormal, and there is, allegedly, so much to lean into. Starting off with, of course, probably their most famous entity, because while the legend of Chloe's life ends with her body being thrown into the Mississippi River, it seems like that extra step didn't stop her spirit from maybe coming back to the Myrtles, because over the years, she's actually been seen wandering around the property, usually around the front of the house, but not always, and it's even thought that that infamous photo that was taken by Tita Moss appears to capture the figure of Chloe herself. And I mean, by looking at the photo, you can see that there is something in between those two buildings. But the backstory of this photo is that Tita had to take some photos of the property for insurance purposes. Basically, the insurance company wanted to see the distance between the general store and the butler's pantry. They needed that for their records. So she took this photo, sent it off, but it was rejected by the insurers as they said you can't have any people in the photo. It's only when she looked closer at the photo that she saw this figure. It looks to be wearing a turban or bonnet or something, but then also you can see the boarding of the building behind her upper body. And so the quality of this photo isn't great. apparently Tita has the original under lock and key, but who knows. But there are other people who have had much closer encounters with what could be this entity. In 1987, when Frances Kermeen owned the property, she was asleep in one of the downstairs bedrooms. In the middle of the night, she woke up with just this super strong feeling that she wasn't alone in the room. Felt super uneasy. She opened her eyes and saw that there was a woman wearing a green turban, just like Chloe was reported to have worn, standing next to her bed, staring at her. And what was interesting is that this woman was holding a candle, and this candle was kicking out light. It was lighting up the room enough for Frances to clearly see this figure. She naturally freaks out, puts her head under the covers and screams for Jim, but he doesn't come. So she decides, right, gotta put my big girl pants on, takes the covers off her head. The figure is still standing there looking down at her. Frances reaches out to try and touch the woman, and as soon as her hand should have made contact with the woman's dress, the figure disappears, and the room is plunged into complete darkness. And there was also a story of like a reenactment actress, and I don't know when this happened, what kind of era this was, as I think they've been running tours here since like the 70s, but apparently this actress had been hired to play Chloe, kind of acting out her story, and she was waiting behind a dressing screen until it was time for her to make her appearance. And just an important note about this dressing screen, the top of it was made from glass so she could see out into the room. And at this point, it must have been at night, and the only light in the room was from the candle that this actress was holding. All of a sudden, according to her, the temperature in the room plummeted, just went freezing cold. She looked around and she could see this blue orb levitating in the corner of the room. The orb then apparently got bigger and bigger, moving more towards the centre of the room where it turned into a green mist. The mist started dissolving away, and what was left was the apparition of, according to this actress, a slave girl with a green scarf wrapped around her head. Obviously, to the actress, she immediately thought, this is the girl that she's been hired to play. This was Chloe. She was absolutely terrified and couldn't move a muscle, like completely frozen in fear. But the figure just smiled at the actress, held a finger to her lips in a kind of shushing motion, and then blew on the glass of the dressing screen. Apparently, this figure's breath was so cold that it blew out the candle that the actress was holding, meaning the only light in the room then at that point was some of the blue light coming from this figure. She then dissolved back into the green mist, which then also faded away, leaving the actress alone in this completely dark room. She naturally freaked out, started screaming hysterically, dropped the now blown out candle and legged it out the room and all the way out of the house. Funnily enough, she refused to ever set foot on the entire property again. And that encounter, just like any other that you can find out about, they're not nasty experiences. Even with what allegedly happened to her, Chloe is not a negative entity in any way. I mean, there aren't any overtly malevolent entities at the Myrtles from what I can tell. Chloe, she apparently can be a bit mischievous at times, and she's been allegedly known to steal earrings from guests, but only one out of a pair of earrings, obviously because the story goes that only one of Chloe's ears were brutally cut off. But staff members say that the missing earring always shows up eventually somewhere else in the house. And then apparently Chloe's victims, Sarah Woodruff and her two children Cornelia and James, have also been seen at the Myrtles. And they seem to be especially attached to a certain piece of furniture, a mirror that's now hanging in the hall. And there's a story behind this, because especially back then, if a loved one was about to pass away or had just passed away, you'd cover all the mirrors in the house with a black cloth, because it was said that as your loved one's soul exited the house after death to go to heaven, they could get trapped in any mirror that wasn't covered. And so the story goes that because the poisoning happened so suddenly, and this particular mirror was hanging in the dining room at the time, it was overlooked and wasn't covered up. And so that's why Sarah Woodruff and the children are now trapped at the Myrtles Plantation. The most common phenomenon surrounding this mirror is that weird handprints will appear on the mirror, even after it's been cleaned. Like the cleaning staff will wipe the mirror, go off and clean something else, and then come back and there's little handprints all over it. Sometimes, apparently, you'll be cleaning the mirror again, and you'll see the mom and two kids appear in the mirror looking back at you, which is incredibly creepy to think about. And so now the staff will encourage guests to take photos of this mirror, as apparently quite often visitors will capture weird figures in the mirror behind them. And there are also marks on the mirror itself. So on the right hand side, it's said to look like the side profile of a woman with claw marks around here, and it's said that it's Sarah trying to claw her way out. There's also been what look like drop marks that visitors have taken photos of, and in the photos it looks like it's got a reddish tint to them, leading some people to believe that they are the blood of the souls trapped in the mirror. Apparently the Myrtles have had the mirror resilvered like 10 times, had the reflective backing changed, and these marks never go away. And I don't really know about the marks themselves. I think there might be a little bit of matrixing going on here, especially with that side profile of the woman. And then it's an old mirror. Are these marks something to do with the marks on the glass glass itself, not the reflective bit. I don't know. But those are the stories around Chloe, her supposed victims, and the haunted mirror. And they all fit really neatly into the legend. They all have that convenient little tie-in. She only steals one earring because she had one ear. She's always wearing a green turban because that's what she used to hide her disfigurement. There's an adult woman and 2 children seen in the mirror because those are the family members that Clark lost to Chloe's poisoned birthday cake. No matter what holes you might start poking in the phenomenon around the mirror, all of these little tie-ins to the legend make it all sound really compelling, don't they? But the problem is, there is a massive hole in this story that we cannot get away from. There's no evidence of a Chloe ever existing at the Myrtles Plantation. And the more I dug into this, the more damning the story got, really. It is true, Clark Woodruff lost his wife and 2 kids, but it wasn't to poison. They were all recorded in the parish records as dying of yellow fever, with Sarah passing away in July 1823, James in July 1824, and Cornelia a few months later in September. Another point disproving this Chloe story is that Sarah was supposedly pregnant at the time that this poisoning was said to have happened. If Sarah had been poisoned and died, she wouldn't have given birth to her 3rd child, Mary Octavia, who we know most definitely survived, moved away to New Orleans with her dad Clark when he sold the plantation to Ruffin Grace Sterling, and then went on to live until she was 71 years old. Apparently, when a tour guide at the Myrtles was challenged about this, they tried to argue that Chloe most definitely existed because Clark Woodruff kept a diary in which he had written about how pretty this slave girl called Chloe was. Okay, fair enough. Where is this diary then? Well, obviously the original is kept under lock and key by the owners, for safekeeping. But there was a copy at the West Feliciana Parish Library. But when this person went to go check, the library did not have a copy of this diary, and to just take it one step further, because why not? We're here now. Even the West Feliciana Parish Court Archives had no records of a slave called Chloe ever being at the Myrtles Plantation. But then why do so many people report this paranormal phenomena of a figure in a green turban? Is it just the power of suggestion? They know the story and they're conditioned to be looking out for this green turban? Maybe. Or could it be that there is an actual entity that haunts the Myrtles Plantation with green headwear, but it's not Chloe? Because 4 decades before the property ever even became a tourist attraction, in 1941, a book was published called Louisiana, A Guide to the State. And this was the first recorded mention of this place actually being haunted. But it wasn't by a slave girl with a green turban on. It was by a French lady who was known to wear a green bonnet. And is that maybe the figure that was captured in Tita's photo in 1992? Who knows? Because before that, both Tita and John, they didn't really believe in the paranormal anyway. They knew that the place that they had bought featured on all of these top most haunted lists, but they didn't really take any notice of it until that photo. But then, if there was any doubt in Tita's mind after that, that would all change the year after the photo was taken in 1993. Obviously, Tita and John were working flat out all the hours trying to make their business work, and they'd employed a nanny to look after their youngest son Morgan, who was 10 months old at the time. Tita was just in the office writing out the menus for that night, and Morgan was asleep in his room. The nanny had a baby monitor with her, and she was off doing the laundry, so Tita was there typing away, and she just started to get a bad feeling. Like a really bad, complete dread kind of feeling. And then she heard a deep raspy voice say, "Check your baby." What? Okay, that was very weird, but she's exhausted from working all of the hours and having a young baby. She's probably just hearing things. But then she heard the voice again, and it was more forceful, more urgent. "Check your baby." Tita heard this voice loud enough that she immediately jumped up from her chair and just decided, you know what? I'm just gonna go check on the baby. She went to Morgan's room and it was empty. Cue that horrible, empty, drop in your stomach feeling. You know exactly the one. She started running from room to room, trying to find Morgan, screaming out for him. Couldn't find him. Or for that matter, the nanny. That's not part of the story, but she doesn't get mentioned. I have no idea where she is at this point. But anyway, Tita is running around the house. Morgan isn't there. She runs outside and sees Morgan tottering over towards the pond. He was 10.5 months old at this point. He'd only been walking for about 3 weeks, and here he was. Somehow he had gotten out of his room through 2 sets of big heavy doors without making a sound, and was now about a few feet away from the pond. Tita sprints full pelt towards Morgan and scoops him up just as he's about to fall in. Obviously, she's there holding onto her baby. She's a mother. She starts feeling all of the feelings, all of the worst case scenarios are still running through her head while she's there holding onto him. What if I hadn't got there in time? What if I'd ignored the feeling? What if this? What if that? At that moment, she said that she felt what seemed like a blanket wrap around them. There was nothing there, but Tita could vividly feel the warmth and the fabric. All of her fears and panic completely melted away, and then she heard that same raspy voice again. It said, "You don't need to worry, your family will never be harmed here." So I'd say that at least for Tita, that's a pretty compelling encounter with the paranormal. And for this one story of seemingly, at least for Tita, paranormal intervention, it does seem that a lot of the potentially unexplained stories from the Myrtles Plantation are a bit more residual in nature. In the Woodruff Suite, for example, one of the guest rooms, that's said to be particularly active. Fairly regularly, guests will wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of piano music playing. And there is a piano in the foyer, so right below the Woodruff Suite. So people wake up hearing this music at 2 a.m. and think, oh, that's a bit rude, it's 2 a.m. But just assume it's another guest having a bit of a jolly. But what they don't realise is that there is no one down there. No one else has access to that foyer. It is only for the people staying in the Woodruff Suite. And so there are stories coming out of every single one of the guest rooms, but the one that really creeps me out is the John Leake room, because it's said that that was where a Confederate soldier was laid up after his leg was injured in the Civil War. And there were stories that he died when his leg went gangrenous and the infection killed him, but then there were other versions of the story that said he wasn't actually supposed to have been laid up here and was kind of hiding out for 2 months while the people living at the plantation helped nurse him back to health, until a neighbour found out and was so disgusted that this soldier had abandoned his post, he went and grasped on him. The story branches into 2 more different versions here. Some say that he was executed on the grounds of the Myrtles Plantation, and then some say he was just taken away and dealt with off the property. But whatever the story, it does seem like he's come back and is known to be most active during the months of May and June. Men who stay in the John Leake room will report having super vivid dreams, even hallucinations of the Civil War. And some who report to have had these dreams will go on to claim that they've seen a Confederate soldier lying on the bed with a bandage around his leg. And then other people have claimed to see this soldier not in a dream or hallucination, but crouched in the corner of the room, just as flesh and blood, real as you or me. Crouched in the corner of the room. No, thank you. There was a story of a husband and wife who were staying in this room and they were getting all settled down for the night. The wife was reading a book on the bed and the husband was just in the shower. The wife heard a noise and it sounded a bit weird, so just assumed it was the husband, maybe calling out to her or something. So she called out to her husband, asking what he wanted, and she heard a shush in return. Okay, bit rude. So she called out to her husband again, assuming he had just been the one to shush her. But she got shushed again. This time she got up off the bed and went to go into the bathroom, about to give her husband hell for shushing her, when she realised that he was happy as Larry still in the shower, and not only had he not been the one shushing her, the running water meant that he most definitely hadn't even heard any of this interaction. Okay, so now that realisation is a little terrifying. She grabs her handbag and just hightails it out the room, like, bye husband. I'm leaving you in the haunted room while you're all vulnerable in the shower, but I'm out. He comes out the shower once he's done, gets dressed, obviously wonders where on earth his wife is. He eventually finds her. She's standing outside, adamant that she is not stepping foot back inside that building. You'd better go pack up our things because we are not staying the night in that room. This was not a fight that the husband was going to win. So he went back in, opened the wardrobe to go and grab all their clothes out. But their clothes weren't in there anymore. Instead, there was a single grey Confederate soldier uniform hanging up. Nothing else. He shuts the door thinking, okay, wife must have already pulled the clothes out. He looks around the room. There are no clothes there. So he opens the wardrobe door again, and there are all of their clothes, just as if they have always been there. So he kind of doesn't really think much more about it, locks that up in his little brain box to unpack a little bit later, gathers up all the clothes in the suitcases and goes to leave the room to check out. But he can't, because there's a figure of a Confederate soldier standing in the doorway, blocking his exit. Woof. No, thank you. It doesn't say how the husband eventually got out of that room. I'm assuming he did. He's not still in there. But if it was me, I would have melted. Like, what can you do? There's only one way out of the room and there's a whole ass ghost standing in the door. Nope. But it is far from just the guest rooms. It might even start as soon as you pull up on the drive, because there have been a handful of encounters with a figure that looks like a groundskeeper dressed in his overalls, and he'll appear on the driveway and shout out to you, "What are you doing here?" And then he'll make you turn your car around and shout abuse at you until you leave. And this delightful character is potentially, seemingly to him, just doing his job. And apparently around 1927 there was a groundskeeper who was stabbed to death after being robbed on the property. So 1927, the Myrtles would have been a private property, none of this toing and froing with all of these random cars coming and going. So from that context with that story, kind of makes sense. But honestly, I could keep talking for hours about all the different experiences that have been reported here. I'm just tickling the surface here. I'm not even scratching it. Just trying to give you an idea of the scale of the reports here, because there are just so many. And there are a lot of seemingly potentially poltergeist encounters. The big 300-pound chandelier has been known to swing wildly from side to side, but there's no vibration, no one walking upstairs, no logical reason why it's moving so violently. Rocking chairs out on the veranda will start rocking on their own, but there isn't a breeze or anything. Suitcases will be moved across the room. Phones will apparently be slapped out of guests' hands when they go to take a picture picture, and then other people will report getting hit by the really strong smell of cigar smoke that disappears just as quickly as it arrived. Perhaps one of the more creepy claims is that people will also hear their name being called, and sometimes it's a familiar voice too, like a childhood friend or a parent or something, although that person isn't on this trip with you. But for all of these different encounters being reported, none of it feels like it's really malevolent, just more a bit inconvenient, which the film crew of the remake of A Long Hot Summer, which aired in 1985, found out the hard way. They'd come over to the house the night before and spent hours clearing away the furniture and moving things around so they could get straight on with filming in the morning. They apparently locked the door after they'd finished moving things around, and that was it for the night. The following morning, they opened the room to find that all of the furniture had been moved back to exactly where it was before. Obviously, the film crew were irked, to say the least. They'd just spent a few hours doing this, and now they were going to be behind schedule. So they went and asked the house staff, who's been in and done this? To which they replied, no one has. The room's been locked up and ready for you. You locked the door. Apparently this actually happened several more times over the course of the shoot, so the film crew quickly got the shots they needed and ran ahead of schedule, just so that they could cut their stay at the house short. A similar thing was also reported by the filming crew of Unsolved Mysteries in 2002. They were just having loads of technical difficulties. Mobile phones, video cameras, lighting, pretty much anything tech was going wrong, like constantly malfunctioning. And so could this be like the spirits of children maybe, having a laugh and livening up their afterlife, just causing a bit of harmless mischief? Because apparently there have been hundreds of guests who have seen what looks like a young boy and girl dressed in old-fashioned 1800s clothing playing on the veranda of the house. Cornelia and James Woodruff, who died in 1824 perhaps, or any of the number of other kids who have died at the house over the years. But there is one more ghost story tied to the Myrtles Plantation that I really want to talk about, and it's to do with the murder of William Winter. Remember when he was shot by that unknown horseman in 1871? Well, there was a little bit more to his story too, because the story actually goes that he gets shot in the chest. Obviously his son Francis hears the gunshot, runs out to see his dad has been shot, and the rider is already galloping away. William is just saying over and over, Sarah, Sarah. Obviously he just wants to see his wife again one last time. His son helps William to his feet and they start walking towards the stairs in the house because Sarah is upstairs in the nursery. Francis is screaming for his mum. She already heard the gunshot, so she's on her way down, and they meet on the staircase. William collapses into his wife Sarah's arms and he dies right there on the 17th step of the main staircase. And so now people have claimed to hear footsteps moving through the house, but they're not normal, even footsteps. They sound staggered, uncoordinated, like the person is tripping over their own feet. The footsteps start at the side door of the gentleman's parlour, through the lobby, and begin to climb the stairs. And then they stop at the 17th step, which, I mean, that can only be a residual echo of William Winter, right? Just makes sense. But here's the thing. There was witness testimony taken at the time of William's murder, and the guy didn't even make it back into the house. He died right where he was shot, outside on the veranda. But that doesn't make as good a story, does it? It just seems to be another one, just like the Chloe story, that's been heavily influenced by the legend that's been embellished as it's being passed down. But if you just move the embellishments to the side for a second, there is still a lot of activity that just can't really be explained. And so I can absolutely see why the Myrtles Plantation always seems to take those top spots in those most haunted houses of America lists. But I want to know your thoughts. Tell me what you think. Because for me, I do not doubt for a second that it is haunted. There are so many stories that I've not even mentioned a quarter of them, let alone tickling the surface. I don't even think I'm touching the surface. I'm hovering above the surface right now. There was one of my books. I only took one section out of it. I didn't even get around to finishing the whole thing. And look how much is in here. It's huge. It's written by the same author who wrote the book I used on the Stanley Hotel, and that video was around an hour long. So I think I'll have to come back and do a bonus episode at some point because there was so much that I could have said. But the issue for me is the scale of the embellishments on these legends. Don't get me wrong, when stories are passed down through generations, things get added onto, changed slightly. I totally get it. But when it stops lining up with actual historical fact, it then throws the entire story and then the related paranormal reports into question. Like, why were there uneven, staggering footsteps heard echoing through the house when William Winter died on the veranda? And who is the woman wearing either a green turban, a bonnet, a scarf, whatever it is, when she was being reported way before even the Chloe story? I don't know, it all just puts a little bit of extra doubt in my mind with the whole thing, an extra few grains of salt, if you will. But just from the point of view of the Myrtle staff and owners, like, I'm not knocking it. I understand that as a business, the paranormal is a great way to make money. It's in your interest to keep the stories going, no matter how sensationalized they've become. It's definitely in your interest for your guests to be primed to experience some form of paranormal activity that they've maybe been told about while they're on the tour. So I feel like I've sounded a little bit more critical than usual, but it's just because I value the truth, and I especially value stories that can be backed up with historical records. By all means, talk about the legends, they've got you this far, but explain what could have potentially really happened instead. And if half of what the guests have experienced here is true, they really don't need to lean on all of these sensationalized stories to sell tickets. There's plenty going on already. Like, just as an example, the 1941 book that was published, that didn't mention any of the stories that the tour guides will talk about now, as far as I know. But the fact is that even way back in the 40s, there was talk of ghosts on the property. And so I 100% believe that there is something going on there at the Myrtles Plantation, possibly something residual. Aside from the well-known paranormal reports as well, an overwhelming number of people who visit the place talk about this feeling of a profound, heavy atmosphere around the property. Because while none of the actual spirits that are reported here are known to be particularly negative, there is no getting away from what the plantation was used for. No matter how you feel on the Myrtles, the fact is that this was a site of extreme suffering, like so many other plantations. Enslaved people struggled daily and had to endure harsh conditions and injustices. So it completely makes sense to me from that point of view why visitors would still feel that heavy energy there today. But as always, tell me your thoughts. Have you visited the Myrtles? Did you experience anything? Have you heard a different version of any of the stories? Like, let me know. But if you enjoyed this video, please do let me know by leaving a like on it. And if you're not subscribed already, that is the best way that you can support me and help me to grow this little channel of mine. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe of tuberculosis.